This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Another Labor Day, but what's to celebrate? Professor Gordon Lafer says issues like the minimum wage, a living wage, and paid sick days are winning issues politically, and progressive candidates should call out big business and win. Antitrust expert Sandeep Vaheesan calls out what he says is a corporate conspiracy, aided and abetted by Democrats, to trash the nation's anti-monopoly laws. And Bill Press talks with Democratic strategist Erikka Knuti. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. As we commemorate another Labor Day, Professor Gordon Lafer reminds us that unions gave us the minimum wage, the 8-hour day, and child labor laws, all of which were opposed by the Chamber of Commerce, which continues to oppose what most working Americans demand. And we say hello to Gordon Lafer, political economist and an associate professor at the University of Oregon's Labor Education and Research Center. He's written widely on issues of labor and employment policy and has served as labor policy advisor for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Labor. Gordon Lafer, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Our pleasure. You document a state-by-state and a national effort by Republicans to strip workers of their rights and a decent living wage. How should progressives be fighting the war against workers, at the margins or frontally?
I think this has to be a front and center issue. I think it's a critical issue, and I think it's a winning issue. I mean, if you look at things like increasing the minimum wage, the right to a living wage, the right to paid sick days, these are all things that there is broad bipartisan support for. And I think if there are candidates who run on these issues and articulate it very clearly, not only are they winning issues, but they're hard issues for an opponent to explain why they're opposed to. You have Republican candidates who are getting money from, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce or the Koch brothers or Americans for Prosperity, who are really locked into opposing an increase in the minimum wage, opposing a living wage, opposing a right to paid sick days. And I think the more someone runs at them on those issues, the more they're pushed on those issues, the more they dig themselves into a hole, because there really is no answer to that question that doesn't embarrass them and alienate voters.
Is the war on workers less ideologically driven and simply more for the economic benefit of, say, the Koch brothers and Chamber of Commerce members?
It's a big country and there's a lot of actors, so there are definitely, when you look at what is the money behind these things, it's big business money. So a lot of it, of course, is economically driven. People want to pay less and want their employees to have less negotiating power. But it's also ideological. But in either case, I think that there are, what we have is, in a way, like a legislative agenda of the 1%, and a lot of things being pursued that are happening in state legislators that will harm the vast majority of people in the country, and that candidates are not running on. For instance, you don't have a lot of people running saying, I demand that we lower the minimum wage, but they're voting for it. And therefore, I think it's up to progressive candidates to call them out and to make that an issue in the election.
Are you optimistic at all about either a national or a 50-state raise in the minimum wage?
No.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think I knew the answer to that question before I asked it. So,
on the one hand, I would say no. I'm not optimistic about that. On the other hand, the number of states and localities that have raised minimum wage in the last few years, I think, is something that was unimaginable even 10 years ago. And for instance, the idea that the minimum wage should be indexed to inflation, should go up when the rate of inflation goes up, has become pretty normal in a way that 10 years ago was, it was like this great, big reach to make. So I think on minimum wage in particular, there's been a lot of progress made. And you can see, to some extent, how much progress has been made, especially in local votes, and that what the part of the bill is now being pushed by the Chamber of Commerce and ALEC and their Republican allies and state legislators is state-level bills that make it illegal for any city or county within the state to raise their minimum wage. Because there are about 120 cities or counties that have a minimum wage higher than their states. And because they know that it's popular and that they can't win those votes, their response is to try to make it illegal for people to have a say on something like that. So Indiana, for instance, passed a bill at the state level that says that no city or county within Indiana can pass a bill raising the minimum wage even if 100% of the people vote for it. I think that's both a danger, those kind of preemption bills, but is also a sign of fear on the corporate lobby side and a sign of recognition of how popular these things are. So maybe I'll revise my first totally pessimistic response, say no, I don't think there's going to be a 50-state strategy, but I do think it's kind of on a roll in a way that is more promising than anyone foresaw not long ago.
Yeah, certainly more pressure now on acting on that than there has been in quite some time. We're speaking with Gordon Lafer, political economist and associate professor at the University of Oregon's Labor Education and Research Center. How should we respond to the Republican argument that raising the minimum wage would lead to more high school dropouts and that young people should work for less and that they should be fired more easily so that they learn how to obey orders?
God, there were 3 or 4 things that I think are wrong in that question. First of all, the idea that raising the minimum wage leads to unemployment, whether among teenagers or anybody else, is very easy to answer and has been answered many times over by researchers. And the way you answer it is you go to the border between 2 states that have different minimum wages, and you look at, go into 2 McDonald's at morning rush hour, and you see how many people are working per customers. You don't need to be a professor or a researcher. Anybody can do this, and I invite any of your listeners to do it. Take a little clicker with you, count the number of customers, count the number of staff people, and see if there's a difference. When this kind of research has been done, and it's been done on a mass statistical basis by university researchers, it always finds the same thing, which is that there is either insignificant or zero impact on employment of raising the minimum wage. So I think that there's no evidence for that. And the other thing I would add is that if you go back in history, the same people who are now saying don't raise the minimum wage because it's going to hurt the little people, it's going to hurt teenagers, it's going to hurt unskilled workers, have been saying for 100 years not to do anything that would improve working conditions. The Chamber of Commerce was against the creation of a minimum wage at all. They were against the 8-hour day. They were against the outlawing of child labor. And if we had believed what they said in the early part of the 20th century, we would still have 12-year-olds working 14 hours a day. So I think there's a lot of historical record and there's a lot of economic record to know that those claims aren't true.
Mm-hmm. Does organized labor share some of the blame for not fighting hard enough, or is it just a hopeless battle in which unions should just try to preserve what little they can?
It's a very hard time for organized labor because unions are so under attack in many ways. Both wages and benefits are under attack. The ability of unions to survive organizationally is under attack. And when you're under attack, you have to devote a significant amount of resources to just for keeping yourself alive to fight another day. At the same time, I think it's important, and I think a lot of unions have done this, which is putting resources towards legislative fights that are not about their own members. I mean, for instance, unions have been the single most important institutional actors behind things like minimum wage and paid sick leave, even though that has nothing to do with union members because wages and sick leave benefits are written into union contracts, so they don't depend on state law for that. So it's a balance. I think that a lot of unions recognize that there's about 7% of the private sector and I think 20% or so of the public sector employees now have unions. That's just not enough to go up against the massive power and money of the corporate lobbies unless there are battles that speak to the needs of more people and that involve more people. So it's a hard situation, but I think that I think the kind of thing that's embedded in your question, which I might say is, don't unions have to do things that are not just for their members, I think is true.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to have to ask you to, since you are a professor, to give some grades here. How do you rate the Obama administration's performance on behalf of American workers?
I hate to say this. You're a show about Democrats, and I worked as a Democratic staffer in the House of Representatives, but I might say a C. Now, maybe you'll say I'm a hard grader, but I think there have been a lot of initiatives that are important for workers that are where the Obama administration has either not taken the right position or taken a position in a lip service kind of way. And frankly, I think that's because there's a lot of when you look at where does the re-election money for Democratic candidates come from, very often that's from Wall Street or big corporations as well. And so for a lot of Democrats, it's easier to be progressive on the environment or on civil liberties than it is on economic rights. So to me, it's been quite disappointing, although clearly better than having a Republican administration would have been.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a fair answer. Now I'm going to ask you to pull out a crystal ball. Do you foresee a Hillary Clinton administration perhaps doing any better?
I don't know. And, crystal balls, political science is a profession that failed to predict giant things like the fall of the Soviet Union. So we don't have a very good track record on saying what's going to happen in the future. I would hope that, I think it's, for Hillary Clinton, it's less about, who is Hillary or what are the people that she would bring into her administration than what's the time in American history that she or somebody will take office, which is, people are coming into office at a time when more and more people are in harder and harder economic straits and are, becoming kind of hopeless. More and more people are more desperate about their ability to make a decent living and to do right by their kids. So my hope is that pressure would lead her administration to do more progressive things, regardless of any predictions about what's in her head in particular.
Okay. That was very well done. You stayed away from a lot of things, but you did give a decent answer. Gordon Lafer, political economist, associate professor at the University of Oregon's Labor Education and Research Center. Very much appreciate your time today with us on americasdemocrats.org, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
Okay, thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Every day, in almost every transaction, working Americans pay higher prices than they should. Why? Antitrust lawyer Sandeep Vaheesan says it's because corporations have fundamentally altered the nation's court system to operate against consumers. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
In the run-up to this Labor Day, I've noticed several CEOs, political pundits, and so-called economic experts saying they're confused as to why Americans are so down. Consumers should be out buying stuff, they say, for the economy is humming again. Just look at the key indicators. GDP is growing, corporate profits are high, the stock market is soaring, jobs are being created, the unemployment rate is steadily dropping, and people's disposable income is up. Yet, as the CEO of the Container Store recently grumped, consumers are in a retail funk. That's so cluelessly wrong, sir. Consumers, unlike you Platinum Card members of the CEO Club, are in an income funk, meaning we have very little of the green stuff coming in. The bottom line is that Americans are down because most of us are down. Yearly income for the typical household is $3,300 lower today than it was in 2007 when Wall Street barons crashed our economy. Or look at what's happened to the typical American family's net worth. It was nearly $88,000  10 years ago. But today, it's down to $56,000. That's more than a one-third drop, even though we're told that America is enjoying a strong recovery. And the picture is not getting any brighter because a new normal has been imposed on America's workforce. Senior CEO has been gleefully slashing both jobs and pay, reducing the future of work to a low-wage, no-benefits, part-time grind. One more number, 48% of adults now hold full-time jobs, leaving more than half of us trying to make ends meet on part-time work. This is Jim Hightower saying, the lesson for the powers that be on this Labor Day is that there is no species called consumers. Rather, that creature is just a worker with a decent-paying job. Eliminate the job or shrivel the pay and poof, consumerism goes away.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Antitrust expert Sandeep Vaheesan reveals how a corporate conspiracy has turned consumers into opponents of government regulation and let monopolies run wild. And we say hello to Sandeep Vaheesan, a special counsel at the American Antitrust Institute and co-author with Lena Khan of an article that traces how 100 years after the trust-busting progressive presidencies, corporations now rule the country and make us uncompetitive and unequal. Sandeep Vaheesan, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks so much for having me, Jim.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you here. You lay out a case where almost everything we do on a day-to-day basis, go to work, turn on the TV, go to a doctor's appointment, have a beer, it costs us way more than it should because of corporate monopolies. Is there a conspiracy at work here?
I guess to provide it depends sort of answer, I would say yes and no. On the one hand, there are examples of collusion in the classic secretive smoke-filled room sense. A good recent example being the successful attempt by many large financial institutions to rig LIBOR, which is one of the world's leading interest rates. So there is some classic conspiracies going on, but much of this is happening in the open. Mergers and acquisitions are reported in the press every day. There's nothing secretive or closeted about them. And big companies have actually acquired so much power through consolidation. They have the power to raise prices and effectively kill their rivals. And I would say, if we are to think in terms of conspiracies, the bigger question is, why did we take these conscious political decisions to allow this state to come into existence? And I would say this reflects, in a sense, a deeper intellectual and political conspiracy at work, funded and advanced largely by big business interests. So you see things like corporate funding for universities and think tanks to change the intellectual agenda, so to speak. Economics departments have become much more free market oriented over the past few decades. The University of Chicago is a great example, and it's synonymous with free market thinking, and a lot of that is the result of big business influence. And similarly, you see big businesses sponsoring think tanks in D.C., whether it's the American Enterprise Institute or the Cato Institute, that toe the corporate line and advance this idealized vision of the free market and this notion that big business and ordinary people are allies and that government is the source of all that ails us. And in addition to that, you have big business's influence in the political sector, whether it's through campaign contributions or direct lobbying of members of Congress and the executive branch. So there is a deeper conspiracy in that big businesses help change our economic framework and how we think about markets and government regulation. And they have been successful in changing the conversation and making many Americans believe that big business is our friend and that government is actually the enemy.
All while undermining our antitrust laws. That's which is just crazy. So, can this massive shift of wealth from the middle class to the super rich, can that be traced directly to the Reagan administration?
Absolutely. The Reagan administration quite consciously decided to change the interpretation of the antitrust laws. Before Reagan became president, antitrust sought to promote a variety of objectives, just to name a few: consumer choice, open markets, and innovation. But Reagan appointed a number of very prominent conservatives, both to the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission, as well as the federal courts, who had a very different view of the antitrust laws. They believed that economic efficiency should be the only goal, regardless of what Congress said. Even if Congress had other objectives in mind when it passed the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act at the turn of the 20th century, these appointees said that economic efficiency is the one and only goal, Congress be damned. And in practice, what this focus on efficiency meant was mega mergers and predatory business conduct went largely unchallenged. Large corporations had free rein to do as they pleased. And you saw that in the antitrust stats in the 1980s. The Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice were doing very little to stop what big business was doing. And unfortunately, subsequent administrations, whether Democratic or Republican, have largely followed this approach. Insofar as there are differences, they tend to be at the margins. There is a small uptick in enforcement when you have a Democratic president, but the differences are fairly minor. I mean, we can think of cases in recent years that Democratic administrations have brought, but Republicans wouldn't have. A good example is in 2011, the Obama Justice Department stopped the merger between T-Mobile and AT&T. Would the Bush administration have stopped that deal? Maybe not. But generally speaking, Democratic and Republican administrations are operating from the same economic playbook.
What are there some examples of day-to-day corporate price gouging that we may not even be aware of that's going on now?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say healthcare is the one huge sector where the lack of competition is costing us literally hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's worth remembering that healthcare amounts to nearly 1/5 of our economy today. So $1 in $5 we spend, on average, goes toward healthcare. And we've talked a great deal as Americans about the healthcare crisis over the past 5 years, especially leading up to and in the wake of the Affordable Care Act. And people have posited a number of reasons why healthcare is so expensive. Conservatives have claimed it's because of medical malpractice lawsuits, plaintiffs' lawyers are out of control. There's very little evidence for that theory, but they continue to advance it. And progressives have said big problem is fee-for-service. Doctors and hospitals are compensated on the basis of how much care they provide instead of how healthy their patients are. And that's an important factor. Fee-for-service is a huge issue. But the lack of competition has been largely ignored, especially in hospital markets. There's been a wave of consolidation among hospitals across the country over the past 30 years. And this has given them the power to raise prices on a variety of medical services. Time magazine had an excellent cover story in early 2013 that discussed how hospitals impose huge markups on everything from Kleenex to chemotherapy. And fairly comprehensive academic research has shown that we pay several hundreds of billions of dollars more annually for healthcare because of the power of hospitals and other healthcare providers. If you want to look at the distributional effects, it's pretty clear. If you go to many cities, you see hospitals building gleaming new facilities every year and paying their top administrators huge salaries. And at the same time, millions of Americans are struggling to obtain basic health care. So I'd say healthcare is the one huge example that's largely gone unnoticed. Competition, a lack of competition, more accurately, is one reason why we pay so much for healthcare and why so many of us get so little healthcare.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Sandeep Vaheesan, special counsel at the American Antitrust Institute. But is it strictly a matter of classic capitalism at work, Sandeep? You know, where companies merging and becoming more efficient on behalf of their stockholders? Playing the devil's advocate here, I guess.
No, that's the common defense of consolidation. Proponents of mergers and acquisitions say unless companies are big, they can't serve the market efficiently and they can't compete against their international rivals. And no one is saying that large scale is unnecessary. After all, you can't manufacture cars out of your garage. But the debate is not whether we should have 1,000 firms in every market. The question is, why should we have 3 or 4 big businesses dominating a market instead of 9 or 10? Where's the evidence that bigger is necessarily better for the ordinary person? It's more just an article of faith. So many people have come to believe that big is big is in fact better. And yet there's very little empirical evidence for that. On the other hand, we see the damaging effects of consolidation everywhere, whether in agriculture or broadband service or healthcare. We're paying more for what we buy and receiving less for what we do because of a lack of competition. And on top of that, you see these powerful corporations, oligopolists and monopolists, distorting the political process to advance their own ends at the expense of the 99%.
Yeah. What do you suggest for increasing competition? And then, and this may be a silly question, how likely are Congress and the courts to enact them?
At this point, in the very short term, I'm not too optimistic. But there are reasons for hope. One positive is the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission have tremendous control over antitrust policy. For example, they issue guidelines on when they'll block mergers. And one thing they could easily do is start challenging more mergers and stopping them outright instead of allowing them in return for various conditions. Along with that, the Federal Trade Commission has very broad rulemaking authority. It could, for instance, issue tighter rules on what monopolistic and other dominant firms are allowed to do. Of course, a common response to this is, sure, that even if the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission are aggressive, they'll have to face judicial review at some point, and the courts are not very sympathetic to activist agencies. But even there, we've had 5 years of Democratic control of the White House, and President Obama has appointed hundreds of judges to the federal courts. So the courts are now less conservative than they were even 5 years ago. And so one thing we can do is demand more from the antitrust agencies in the near term. They can take affirmative steps to at least prevent things from getting worse and eventually creating more competition in our economy. But at the same time, we also have to realize the political challenge that we face. We have powerful opponents of antitrust on one hand, essentially the Fortune 500, and no one to really provide a counterweight to their clout and money. So we need to try and change the political dynamic before we can expect major policy changes. Mm-hmm. We need to raise awareness among ordinary Americans and try to establish a countervailing force to the power of big business.
Well, it's been chipped away at for many, many years, so I guess it's going to be a long, hard road back. That would be my assessment anyway. Sandeep Vaheesan, a special counsel at the American Antitrust Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today here on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks so much, Jim.
All right. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, political analyst Erikka Knuti.
Taking a look at the political front across the board with us, Democratic strategist joining us in studio, Erikka Knuti. Hi, Erikka. Nice to see you.
Hi. Happy.
Hey, thanks for coming in.
Happy to be here.
Mitch McConnell, he's not the only one who showed up, but basically the Koch brothers hold their parties and, members of the Supreme Court, the United States Senate, they all just come and say...
Why not, right? I mean, I guess Father's Day is a family day, so why not be with family?
Yeah,
I mean,
brothers, the Koch brothers, right?
Yeah,
right? I mean, really, when you work that closely together as a group, I feel like you should come together, break bread together, and really celebrate your unity.
But really shows who Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party are working for, right?
Well, I mean, Mitch McConnell's in the fight for his life. This is a race that shouldn't be this close for him. I'm sure after Eric Cantor losing his seat in Virginia, he is even more on edge, and he's not taking anything for granted. Anyone who's got a check, I'm sure, anybody who can help put boots on the ground or put ads on air, he is going to be checking with and checking in on. I mean, he had to, after the Tea Party and a lot of the kind of more new conservative money groups split from him during the primary, mm-hmm. and that was kind of an acrimonious split. He's got to just make sure that he circles back and that collects as much of that money as possible, because Allison Lundergan Grimes is raising money left and right. I mean, she's a really strong candidate.
Allison Ludison Grimes entered the first grade the same year that Mitch McConnell entered the United States Senate.
I tell everybody there's no bigger contrast than these two. I mean, she's, this young woman, small, young family, bright, up and coming, and he's this old white man who's angry at immigrants and hates health care.
And looks like a turtle.
Right, and looks like
No, there was one.
That's fair. I think that's fair.
One of the Tea Party candidates in the primary, I'm not being mean by saying, actually ran an ad calling him the turtle or something like that because they said he looked like a turtle.
Oh.
No.
I mean, I don't feel bad. What am I kidding?
No.
Some people have, I think you have kind of like a spirit animal everybody has, like where you can identify with an animal. Mitch McConnell's is a turtle.
That's fair.
I love the Allison Ludison. One of her favorite lines in the campaign is, I'm only 35, but that's Mitch McConnell's approval number in Kentucky.
Oh, whoa, man. That's good.
35.
I mean, if you look back in the spring, I haven't checked on it in the last month or two, but Obamacare's approval ratings are higher than Mitch McConnell's in Kentucky.
Yeah, right.
So that's going to be interesting for him. I mean, people in Kentucky have really bad health problems. They're some of the worst in the country. And when you look at how well, Kentucky's done on the state exchanges, people now have health insurance.
The most successful state exchange in the country.
Probably. I mean, it has to be.
Yeah.
I think 50% of their uninsured population is now insured, something astronomical. They've really been leading the country, something that you should be proud of, absolutely. But, running against the president, running against Obamacare isn't going to work there.
And then Mitch McConnell made the pretty embarrassing gaffe, very embarrassing gaffe, by saying, well, we're going to get rid of Obamacare, but Kentucky Care will continue, right?
Which doesn't quite work like that.
Doesn't quite work like that, right? No, exactly. Also, I want to ask you about Florida. So now, can we trust Charlie Crist, former Republican, to be our Democratic candidate in Florida?
I think we can trust him a lot more than we can trust Rick Scott. When you look at Crist's policies, and I think this is, he's late to the party, but I'm okay with that. Just as long as you finally make it, I'm all right.
As long as you show up.
As long as you show up, says the person who's late. But but honestly, I mean, if you look at where a lot of Republicans have been over the last 20 years, policies that would have made you solidly a moderate to conservative Republican now make you a Democrat. And so if we are the big tent party that I believe we are, where we are willing to take ideas from all different walks of life in different places, that we are a party that is a home for people that want to do work, want government to work, then I'm open arms. Mm-hmm. And Rick Scott has been terrible for the state of Florida. Really draconian. I mean, this is a guy who had the largest fraud settlement against Medicare in the history of Medicare. He looks like, speaking of things that you look like, he looks like a Marvel comic villain. But he's also, the drug testing for unemployment insurance, which was found to be unconstitutional, and they had to stop. Not only was it wasteful in terms of money, it cost so much money to actually implement, but it was, also kind of violated people's rights. Yeah. So in terms of Rick Scott versus Charlie Crist, I'll go Charlie Crist every day.
Yeah,
no problem.
No, I would too. I like Charlie Crist, and I mean, I think he was a good governor for Florida. He was a Republican. He's turned around on a lot of issues.
A lot, yeah.
But he's come in the right direction. Then as an independent, and I think he's probably the strongest candidate that we've got down there. So
well, and I think Florida's not an easy state. It's when you look at the Panhandle versus then like Miami and some of the southern, and you have these big tech areas, but then you have very rural areas with large unemployment and very difficult economic dynamics. It's a state that requires a lot of consensus building, and you can't be a demagogue in a state that has those kind of issues. And Charlie Crist's record working with state politicians, getting stuff done, reaching across the aisle, I like it.
Right.
Florida is not a state. Florida is its own little nation, right? Like it's not part of the South. It's not. It's Florida.
It's definitely not Southern.
It's just Florida.
It's a weird dynamic because so many people have moved there, aren't from there. So Florida's this kind of like catch-all for what? I mean, I think 40% of the population. How do I even remember these numbers? Have moved there and migrated there.
Oh, easily. I think it may be even harder. What was it? Ronnie Musgrove, who was in the studio with us, former Democratic governor of Mississippi. Yes, there was at one time a Democratic governor of Mississippi, not so long ago. But as he says about Florida, the farther south you go, the more in Florida, the farther south you go, the more north you get.
Right, because it's the north. It's Northerners who want it tan.
Right.
I mean, it's
escaping, the
Minnesota
Northwest.
winters, New York winters. I get it. My aunt and uncle go down there in the winter from Minnesota. I think they put in enough time up in Minnesota. They've earned the right to a sunny winter. I'm okay with that.
And it's also, it's extremely rural in some areas.
Very rural and not great farmland. So it's an interesting, whereas a lot of rural America and a lot of our rural policies are based around farming, it doesn't really fit the bill in Florida.
In the rural areas, they just have boa constrictors and crocodiles.
Things that are trying to kill you. They're like the Australia of America, where everywhere you go, there's danger.
Erikka Knuti here. Erikka, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand has a new book out.
She does.
She's great. I love her. And she talks in her book about some of the comments made to her by male senators, especially 4 of them. She's had a little weight problem. She's lost some weight. I think
she had 2 kids. She had twins. I mean,
she had twins,
she didn't have a weight problem. She had babies.
Right. So one of these male senators comes up to her after she had lost 50 pounds, puts his hands on her waist, and says to her, "Don't lose too much weight now. I like my girls chubby." She also talks about when she was in the House, a Southern member of the House told her, quote, Kirsten, you're even pretty when you're fat. I mean, this stuff goes on.
By the way, if there was ever a more Southern compliment, I've never heard of one better than that. You're even pretty when you're fat, sugar.
Yeah.
No, it does. Actually, I remember when that comment happened, I was working for Amy Klobuchar at the time. And so when Kirsten started, she was meeting with a nutritionist and started losing weight and talked about it actually a lot with various reports, women's magazines, about the struggle that she was having, kind of getting back in shape and balancing small children with working and trying to get back in shape. And it's something that everybody, every woman goes through. And I remember when that comment was made, actually. And the thing about a lot of people talk about how great Olympia Snow and Susan Collins are reaching across the aisle with Landrieu and Klobuchar, and the reason is because these women are, as Mikulski used to always say, will truly be equal when there is as many mediocre women senators as there are mediocre men senators. These women are all very exceptional, but they are, they're a minority, and they do work together and stick together. And I remember when this happened, and they do have a kind of a hostile environment sometimes.
Right. That's all for AmericasDemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Gordon Lafer, Sandeep Vaheesan, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For AmericasDemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate.